great founders actually always create a blend in their teams of experienced operators and sort of, first time folks. So if you look at Stripe in the early days, they had this like really good blend. They hired Billy Alvarado like very early on, and they hired Claire Hughes Johnson slightly later. So, their leadership team was very much a balance of both experienced operators as well as people doing it for the first time. So I think you need both, honestly, because you do need that sort of complete optimism of like, this is just going to work. That sometimes very early career folks are the only ones that have that. And then you need that sort of tempered with, I have seen all the ways in which this can go wrong. So we're going to skip all the mistakes and go straight to like the right way to do something.
Welcome to Brick by Brick, where we learn how successful startups were really built directly from the people who built them. My name is Arpin Panyani, co-founder of Garuda Ventures. Today, our guest is Uma Chingunde. Uma is a seasoned engineering leader. She was previously the VP of Engineering at Render, an engineering leader at Stripe, and started her career at VMware. In today's episode, Uma shares her advice on how to balance uptime and reliability with feature release cadence, staying level-headed through engineering incidents, and how startups that are selling to the engineering function should think about showing value in the post-ZIRP era. Enjoy!
Hi, Uma. How are you?
Hello, I'm good. How are you?
Good to see you. Thanks for making time to join us here on the Brick by Brick podcast.
Yes, very happy to be here. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, good. I think you might be, I believe, our 10th episode, if I've got the sequencing right. So we've been doing this for a few months now. As I just mentioned to you off camera, Rishi and I, we run Garuda Ventures, a pre-seed focused B2B fund, and we decided to build this podcast Brick by Brick to share the stories of startup operators, people who have lived through and are living through startup life. Sometimes those stories that aren't told, that people often hear from the founders themselves. It's good to hear from folks who are actually doing work as well, and building things. So thank you for making some time. Why don't I start with a bit of sharing a bit of context on how we've got to know each other over the last, let's say, year. And then what I'd love to do is chat with you about your background, this amazing career in different engineering roles. Being a senior engineering leader, I think this will also be a different than some of the other guests we've had who've been more sales and marketing focused. And then, of course, sort of advice and lessons learned in the engineering function, maybe some things about career advice, both for folks like you and then maybe for younger folks earlier in their career. And we'll just talk about, all the fun things. Does that work?
Sounds good. I'm excited.
All right. Cool. So let's just jump right in. So we did meet recently through First Round Capital's Angel Track program. I had just left Okta. I was building Garuda with my partner, and that's an amazing program First Round puts together, both for the content, but also for learning and meeting other check writers in Silicon Valley and really in startup land, wherever they are. And so we met through that, and we've been through some events together, and I've enjoyed getting to know you personally, as well as how you think about writing checks. And I think today we'll jump into some of your background. So maybe just start with kind of, how did you decide to go the computer science route? Just kind of going back to, when you joined the workforce or started studies back in India, I believe. So tell us about your journey to CS, and then what prompted you to move out here.
Yeah, it's actually funny because I don't have one of those fun stories of, my parents did actually have a computer which I liked using, but the reason to get into it was actually literally a process of elimination. My parents are both academics, and they were, unusually for Indian parents, were like, do what you love, which is, if anyone has Indian parents knows that that's actually quite rare. And I was like, oh, that's too much freedom. And I didn't actually have anything I was particularly passionate about. And CS was still up and coming. And what a lot of people told me was it was sort of like a very broad, broad area, and that I could do whatever I wanted if I did like CS. And so I was like, okay, I'm not closing off any options if I do this. And actually, and that's sort of been kind of like an accidental career path where I've always sort of picked the thing that kept my options open, and that turned out to be, in hindsight, like a pretty good call, where if in doubt, I picked the broader option that left more things open. And that's how I ended up where I
Got
am.
it. And then how did you make a transition, or why, and how did you make a transition to the US?
So it's actually like, a lot of folks, again, are probably familiar. It's a pretty common path, but funnily enough, I actually worked in India for a while and I enjoyed it. But I was in my mid 20s, and the sort of urge to see the world came up. And it was sort of like, I'd actually literally lived in the same city. I was born there. I went to school there. I was working there. So I was like, I need to see the world. And in the 90s and the early 2000s, if you were from India, this was actually one of the few ways you could sort of, like studying abroad was actually one of the paths,
So
studying or working.
it was in your case, was it, sorry to interrupt, was it studying abroad, or you took a job?
Studying abroad, actually. So that I also was at that time, and again, not unusually convinced that I hadn't actually learned that much in my undergrad. So I was like, I don't, this came about by working because, the real world was so different from the theory of tech at that point. So I was like, I don't actually feel like I know enough to be a good developer. So I feel like I need to go back to school. So my desire to like see the world and actually become like a real developer
Cool.
coincided in me wanting. So I moved to the US to do a master's degree in CS.
Amazing. Amazing. Okay. Awesome. And so from there, why don't we talk about? And I don't know if there were other career stops post school before VMware, but I think it makes sense unless you want to take another direction to talk about VMware. So a legendary sort of like Silicon Valley classic business, and virtualization and incredible breakthrough. Even now, of course, now meeting its sort of weird quasi demise through Broadcom,
Yeah,
but like the number of people
this
who have
makes me very sad.
who yeah, like give us any thoughts you have on that. But just for the context for listeners, of course, most people know the name and probably a lot about the business. But in my own network and yours, it's just been this one of these mafias or family trees of people. People come out of Salesforce, people come out of VMware, people come out of sort of Facebook and Google, of course. And VMware is just one of these places that produces incredible people and talent and startups. And so tell me about how you joined VMware. How long were you there, and what were you spending time on while you were there?
There's actually a funny story there, which is so when I worked at this company in India, it was a niche, it was a boutique consulting firm. So, I mean, it still exists and it's great. And their whole premise was offering sort of like pretty specialized services. And their niche was sort of unlike consumer or it was primarily enterprise. And VMware was actually a client of theirs. They use this company, and that's where I actually came across them, and I was like, wow, this is like, for context, this is like the early 2000s when you literally had to dual boot a computer if you wanted both Linux and Windows on the same computer. And so VMware was just like, wow, it's like this whole layer that and it really intersected with my interests, which were very much tied to operating systems, like, very lower level stuff. And so when I was at grad school, I picked all these courses, and when it came to time for applying for internships, I naturally kind of like looked at VMware because I was like, and I ended up doing an internship in their Boston office. And fun fact, I was actually there the summer that they IPO'd. They were a part of EMC, and EMC spun them out, and that was very fun.
Yeah, because EMC is a sort of a Boston area company as
Yeah,
well.
yeah.
Yeah, got it. So you had some exposure to VMware, and then when it was time for recruiting, you said, "Yep, I'm intrigued by this, and this seems magical." The virtualization process. Um, okay, so cool. So tell us a bit about, and this will, I think, dovetail now into where we want to go more broadly with the conversation as to sort of your career trajectory as an engineering kind of leader. But I think at some point in VMware in your tenure there, I don't know how long you were there, but at some point you transition from IC to leader. I guess maybe one, what were the teams or what part of VMware were you working on both as an IC and a manager? And then two, why transition and when
Mhm.
did you decide that?
Yeah, so I worked on the layer. So VMware is like, for folks that might not know, has built the original hypervisor. Like, that's essentially like what underpins cloud computing. Everything, like, there's a hypervisor running in someone's cloud today. So I worked on the layer that was responsible for coordinating or like clustering hypervisors. So you have the individual hypervisors, and then you have this orchestration layer called vCenter. So this was sort of like its combined. They were called vSphere, and this was like its flagship product. Very very interesting. And the really cool tech that I got to be a part of was what was called vMotion, where you do a live migration of virtual machines. And the really cool demo would be you do something like very compute intensive, like high resolution video or something, and you'd be migrating the virtual machine in the background, and it would migrate without any packet loss. Like you're literally moving it across servers. And that was like a fun, very fun thing that I got to be a part of. The management track was actually interesting because I kind of joke like, there's people that are born, there's people that, it's like the famous quote, some people are born into it, some like, so I was one of those accidental managers where my manager actually came to me. This was sort of like an interesting thing where most of VMware's management was actually sort of homegrown. That was a pretty strong culture there. So her org was growing. And I still appreciate her to this day, which is that she sort of, came to me and she recognized something that I was not aware of, which was like, she's like, would you like to be a manager? I was like, I am actually like, I was first surprised because that had actually not occurred to me that I would be good at it. And but after a lot of conversations with her, other people, I was like, I'll give it a shot. And then I ended up really liking it. And I just I the reason for staying in it was that I think I'm actually better at management than I was ever a developer. I actually have this theory that the best managers are not like your 10x engineers at that next level. So I was like, I was never like a 10x engineer. I was actually like the next level. I was a good engineer, but not 10x at any point. So I realized that I can be a far better leader, manager
So it
than
took
I was an MC.
someone, some kind of a mentor or manager to give you that clarity that you might actually be better at being a management manager, and then you hadn't really contemplated it, and you were an accidental, as you said.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, super interesting.
And I'm very glad that I had that opportunity. I think it was a very
Yeah,
this is where luck plays a big part in these.
yeah, right, right. Well, it's just these moments in careers because as we'll get into now, if you look at the trajectory you've had to date, of course you'll continue to do other things in your career, but even to date, post VMware, this is the direction you've gone, and it sounds like it was spawned from that sort of experience at VMware. Sometimes people, I don't know if this was what the prompt was at VMware at that moment. Maybe it is what happens in high growth companies, public or late stage private or early, is growth demands people become
Yeah,
managers sometimes. And so was
yeah.
that going on, that VMware was sort of
It
growing
was,
so quickly that
it wasn't, it was past, it was on a more steady state at that
okay.
point, but that particular org was growing, and that's exactly what was happening. Which, funnily enough, I don't actually agree with the sort of philosophy. I think in this case, my manager got it right, but I do
Mm,
think that that's actually like sometimes a dangerous philosophy where you just like pick someone who you think is good enough and make them the manager. I've seen many
okay.
good engineers sort of, and then fall into that trap, and then they hate management, and then sort of,
Mm.
get
This
burnt
is
out.
definitely one to talk about. Let's make
Yeah.
sure we come back to that. That's super interesting. Okay, cool. So let's talk about your post VMware experience. I believe you went to Stripe next after VMware.
I took a
Now this is
bit of a
interesting.
detour at another
Sure.
company and then went to Stripe.
And then went to Stripe. So I guess maybe before we get into that experience at Stripe, what even prompted you to leave? I mean, VMware is an amazing company. You'll have a great long career. It'll be fun. Like why leave? And why
I
startups?
think I think one is it was very clear to me that they were missing what I was painfully aware of was the
Mm,
SaaS wave, which is
I see.
like cloud computing, like one of,
Yeah.
something that you alluded to earlier, which a big disappointment to me is VMware had like all the building blocks, like literally everything. They
Hmm.
should have been a leading contender in the cloud provider
As like one
race.
of the hyperscalers, like
Yeah, they
AWS,
should
GCP,
have been.
Azure.
Yeah, they should have been that. And it was painfully obvious from the inside that they were not
Mm,
taking that threat seriously.
I see.
And, everyone could see it. And so me and a bunch of peers, this is the growth of SaaS. This is like, when it was a really, it was changing the way software was being built. And I remember talking to a colleague that the world of, shrink wrapped or downloaded software is shrinking
Yeah.
basically. And this
Right.
is
Literally.
SaaS is like the thing. And so
Mm,
I was very intentional, and so that was sort of like disappointing to kind
mm,
of, but the realization that that's what was going to be happening was clear.
hmm.
And that was what one of the
Got it.
key reasons, and which is why when
Yeah.
I was like looking next, I was very intentional to look at
Yeah.
sort of, SaaS based company.
And to that, maybe just one more on that point. Does sometimes the way we sort of after the fact, people in general attribute rash decision making to like logical things. Sometimes it's just gut and like your friends. So I'm just curious, were you seeing folks leaving and catching that wave and saying, "Holy cow!" They went to
Yes,
GCP
yes,
or Facebook or whatever and
yeah,
saying the cloud is the future, and that forced
yes.
you to react, maybe also.
Yes,
Okay.
so I will actually I will actually admit to being very slow. I was probably like one of the last people in my cohort to It
Yeah.
took me like many people telling me this to actually realize.
Mm.
So my advice to my former self would be like, listen to the first person telling you to go to Facebook in 2010 instead of waiting for like,
Yeah.
5 more years before leaving.
Yeah, got it, got it. Okay, so you make this move to Stripe, and I was curious about talking about this point. So Stripe is hyper growth business. You're brought in as an engineering leader, I believe. So maybe start there. Actually, what was your role at
Yeah.
Stripe? What were you brought in to do?
So I joined as a line manager on one of the infrastructure teams. So, Stripe is completely like born in the cloud classic, like that era of companies. So they had a very, very thick infrastructure layer. And this is where, you know, cloud providers are great, but they haven't provided all the primitives to be able to run infrastructure. Like, it gives you essentially like the building blocks, but you still have to build all this internal tooling. And that's what my team did.
So Stripe is a cloud service. There was and is a cloud service, but nothing, as we know, comes fully out of the box from
Yeah.
AWS, GCP,
Yeah.
Azure, and so you're
Yeah.
you were building a layer that
Yeah. You need
ensured.
a pretty big layer there.
Got it. Okay, cool. And so, the thing I was going to say was, in my time at Okta, I was there 2013 to 2021. We went from sort of Series B, a couple hundred people, a few million, to public and beyond. And CTO would do all hands once in a while, and we would talk about these amazing sort of growth curves. And then, funnily enough, you'd see probably in Stripes, maybe it's the inverse in Stripes business, but in the Okta business, you'd see just a 1 day drop or a one
Hmm.
week drop around Christmas. But otherwise, the curve was up and
Yeah.
to the right. And in my role doing partnerships and then M&A in particular, there was always this tension between we have to innovate, we have to stay ahead of the competition, but this is a cloud service. We need to stay up, and even more so with
Yeah.
Okta or with payments, that if the service goes down, people can't do their job or can't make money. So, in your time there, both as your sort of initial manager and then as you moved up the engineering org, how did the company, at least at that time, balance? I mean, how did engineering
Yeah.
balance, the rate of shipping of the product team, famously
Hmm.
fast shipping product team, with, well, the service needs to stay up. That's actually much,
Yeah, that
critical.
was actually, I think this is a great question. I think Stripe was uniquely good and continues to be uniquely good at this. And funnily, like, on the Christmas thing, actually, I still remember because I joined Stripe October 2017 and then quickly learned something that should have been so obvious was that Black Friday, Cyber Monday is the peak. And then that there's like just a continued peak after that through the holidays because those are the highest things. So there's a lot of planning that goes into it. Like Stripe actually works all year round on reliability. My org was part of that. My peer orgs were a part of that. So a bit of it is sort of like ensuring that the current infrastructure, like your current users, have to always be like foremost. I think Stripe continues to be one of the most user obsessed companies, and then that the way it sort of dealt with that was like reliability is essentially like really really important. So like security, reliability were as important as feature velocity. And the way they sort of did that was by kind of separating the concerns where everyone shared in the every in all of it, but the infrastructure team really had a very strong mandate to like build good infrastructure and build it securely, build it reliably. It was then, and I believe continues to be, one of the teams that really invested in that layer. Like very few companies in that era were investing so much in infrastructure and security. Like security was its own large organization there. And I think that sort of empowerment and investment is what gives you compounding returns over time.
I see. Sounds right. Yeah, I mean, it sounds like from a leadership standpoint, the tone was set. And they were
Yeah.
engineers, of course. That we
Yes.
have to be up and not at the expense or as a trade off with
Yeah, I
with
actually have
cost.
a funny story around this, which actually Patrick Collison told he used to meet with every onboarding class, and then
Mm.
he would like it would sort of be like very open, and then he told us how in the early days his pager duty alert was set to this weird duck noise. And then he sort of ended up, because it would go off all the time, he sort of ended up basically having this response to that, and now he
Anxiety.
can never like hear that noise. But that was,
Pavlovian response. Yeah.
exactly,
Yeah.
exactly. So, but the fact that, he would been doing that like right from the beginning, like
Yep.
that had set the tone where,
For
there
sure.
was a lot of empowerment where everyone at the company could basically declare an incident for any
Yep.
reason, and people would just like jump in and fix things immediately. That sense of urgency
Yep.
and response was
Yep.
very strongly across the
Yep.
board.
Anything else you can share from the Stripe experience, and then I want to move on and talk about your kind of your most recent role. But it's such a formative and legendary
Yeah,
Valley company, so you must have
I
picked up
think
some
the
things or learned some things or seen some things that you can share.
I think just the pace. I think that's one of the places where I think they can. That's where it was sort of like there's this kind of trade-off that people talk about between speed and quality, and I think it's one of the places where I learned that that's not necessarily a trade-off. Like you can deliver extremely high quality things at at a pretty good pace. It's not you can always like figure out a way to do both. And that was also like another catchphrase. It's like people would sort of present, can you do X, or can we can do X, or we can do Y, and the CEO would be like, why not both?
Yep.
Or his other
Yeah.
catchphrase was, can we do this faster?
Yeah.
And I think when that sort of tone is set, it really incentivizes everyone to just be like
Yep.
very focused and very relentless
Yeah.
about the pace.
And maybe just to that point, as you think about it sounds like you're in a fast growing group within VMware, but VMware itself was pretty run rate
Yeah,
steady, and then you go to
yeah,
this sort of like super fast compounding business. Did you have to change and grow and or unlearn or learn new tricks to go
yeah.
from
I
VMware to
think
Stripe?
I think that was the primary one, the one I mentioned, where it isn't. I think if and then this is, and I think actually a few different things that I learned at Stripe that I think VMware lacked was there was a huge customer obsession that I mentioned, where there was like no gap between all the engineers and like a user. Like people would directly talk, like jump in on a user issue. But that, and then this sort of like the speed at which you also responded to it with, and the quality. There's a sort of the thing that I had to change was the sense of caution, where where you have to be realistic about the risks you take, but you do have to move quickly.
Yeah. Right. Yeah, yeah, and to your point, I mean, I think it requires leaders to empower teams to do that. And if that's this tone set, then you're empowering people to take risks, move fast, not have everything be perfect. 80/20 makes sense. So let's talk briefly about your most recent opportunity. So if you look at it, obviously, I don't know if this was planned. You tell me if it was planned, but you went from VMware, public company, or during the IPO to Stripe, hyperscaler, hypergrowth, late stage, and then I think you went to Render. It's super interesting, also infrastructure business. So talk about that transition, why that company, and then why you kind of made this move to an even earlier stage company after Stripe.
Yeah, in many ways it was completely not planned. This was like not on my, there's a lot happening in 2020, but leaving Stripe to go to a seed state startup was like completely not on my bingo card for that year. It was totally one of those opportunities where actually the CEO and founder Anurag reached out to me out of the blue, and he's actually an early Stripe engineer. I believe like eight or so. So I when he sort of reached out, I was oh, he just sort of wants to brainstorm. I'd been following Render, like the Stripe Mafia again is like famously like very much out there. I was like, oh, this is a really cool company, and you know I really like what they're doing. So when he reached out, I was imagining, brainstorming infra or similar sort of, in the network. And he was like, no, I'm actually like looking to hire for this role. And I thought someone with your background would be good. So maybe for listeners, like Render is essentially a platform as a service. So what Render tries to build is, if you think of like an internal infrastructure team like Stripe, it takes that out and it allows pretty much any company to build on, instead of having to deal with all the nuts and bolts of a cloud provider. It provides a platform
Yeah.
that you can just
So
run with as a
it's an
developer.
abstraction layer, one layer above
Yeah,
the infrastructure as a service for folks
exactly.
who don't have the capacity to hire
Exactly.
like Stripe did.
Exactly.
Right.
Yeah,
Got
like you don't have to build like 100 plus 200 people infrastructure team. You have
it.
all the building blocks for you.
Yeah.
So given that I was already doing that, it intuitively just made sense. I was like, yes, this is a pretty convincing business, and I can see why it needs to exist. So I was already like convinced of the idea. And so uh, when Anurag and I chatted about potentially joining, I was like, this is intriguing.
Hmm.
And It was sort of on my bucket list, and I think everyone in Silicon Valley always wants to do an early stage startup. It's
Okay.
like one of those sort of things. It was definitely for me. And when I just talked to them, uh, like he's such a great founder,
Mm-hmm.
and the team is exceptional.
Mm-hmm.
And then I was already in love with the idea, so it was like I don't think I'm going to get another opportunity to do
Mm-hmm.
this. Like
Mm-hmm.
one of my kind of key tests is what will I wish I had done when I'm 70,
That's great.
and it's
That's great.
like this was I was like looking back and I was like, yeah, I'll probably regret not taking the leap more than I will like
Yeah.
staying. And I'm very glad I did it. It was like a really amazing run.
Yeah, it's a couple of things you said there that I think are worth diving in, and then I would love to transition to sort of your lessons learned and advice as an seasoned engineering leader. But one of the things you said, and if you marry your path from VMware to Stripe to render, and then you said, I think it's everyone's secret or not so secret wish to be at an early stage company. It's super interesting because one, we rely on that sort of push for venture style businesses to work, which is people like to be in on the ground floor, whether to make money or because they want to be a builder. And two, I think how you did it is I mean there's no one way, but it does feel like that's a good way, which is let me learn what great looks like at VMware, and then let me look what great works looks like at a slightly earlier. And I feel like I'm armed to actually step in as a leader rather than I guess as an IC to a true early stage startup. Does that resonate?
I ended up really liking it. I think in my case, there was also, because I'd moved to the US on an immigrant visa, right? So I think there's like more constraints there where you don't necessarily want to take that risk early on. And I think those were definitely kind of things for me. Still paying off student loans, still on an immigrant visa, you don't really feel like you can, totally like take that leap. But I do think, and in some ways, this actually is like mirrors my experience with going to grad school, which was if I had done it right out of undergrad, I would have actually like not known what I don't know and sort of, would have, taken a very generic sort of approach to a graduate degree. So it's because I had spent this time in industry, it taught me to your point, like, what are the kind of things like I had a more clear interest. Like if I want to do a startup, this is the place I want to kind of join. It gave me this clarity that I definitely didn't want to be a founder. And it also gave me this clarity on the kinds of startups that I find interesting, the kind of people I want to work with. So for that, that was definitely like my personal journey. I don't think I would have had that experience if I tried it early career for myself.
Yeah, and I didn't mean to sort of skip that part, but that's a critical part too. Is like what when are you ready, sort of personally and financially, to join a startup? It's probably not the right thing at all times. We had a guest on a few episodes ago, Avanish Sahai. He was in early days of Oracle, and then sort of went to Salesforce, HubSpot, and he's had similar advice, which is be one on the personal side, if you can get things settled, but two, you can see what world class looks like. If you've seen what it looks like to run at Stripe or VMware scale, then when you join a startup, you're like, well, I actually know what direction we're running. I know where we're trying to get. I know what world class looks like if we can get there 1 year, 2 years, 3 years from now, because I've been there. As opposed to, I mean, there's no one way. You can learn on your own. But I think as an operator rather than as a founder, maybe as a founder too, I think this is a good path.
Yeah, I think as an operator for sure. I'll also say that the other thing I've noticed is that great founders actually always create a blend in their teams of experienced operators and sort of, first time folks. So if you look at Stripe in the early days, they had this like really good blend. Like they hired Billy Alvarado like very early on, and they hired Claire Hughes Johnson slightly later. So, their leadership team was very much a balance of both experienced operators as well as people doing it for the first time. And I think that was a lot of my conversation with Anurag as well. Like he had been on that early team and he knew sort of, that what he needed to kind of, plug in the gaps. So I think you need both, honestly, because you do need that sort of uh, complete optimism of like this is just going to work, that sometimes very early career folks are the only ones that have that. And then you need that sort of tempered with I have seen all the ways in which this can go wrong, so we're going to skip all the mistakes and go straight to like the right way to do something. So you actually need both is
It's a
actually
great it's a great insight. Actually, I don't think I've heard it articulated that way because you don't want all of one perspective and none of the other, but you need both in a
You need
startup.
both.
That
Yeah.
is, yeah.
Yeah.
All right, cool.
That's
Let's talk
actually like you
about
need the optimism thing. Actually,
you
that
need
was one
what.
of the things that used to be like a Stripe principle, an operating principle. I don't know if it still is, but Stripe is for optimists, and I actually think all startups are for optimists.
Mm,
And it's funny because I'm way more of an optimist in the older I get than I was when I was younger, and I think
great.
that's actually like it's been a pretty good growth area for me.
Startups are for optimists. I'm gonna steal that. That is very good. Well, I probably should have heard of it if Stripe has been doing it, but it's a true statement. We There are many analogies, and as we write pre-seed checks, inception stage checks, borrowing from I think Mike Maples. A startup is also analogized to a pirate searching for gold. I mean, there's no mission yet. Your mission is to find product market fit. Once you have it, um, scaling it becomes a different challenge. Yeah, no, I think it's a good insight on balanced teams. Let's switch gears a little and talk about some of these lessons that you've probably gleaned and are continuing to glean over the years. So I just want to talk about CTO, VPNs. This is kind of the role you are at this point in your career. It's a high stakes moment. Breaking changes, services go down. Walk us through what a level headed, a good leader, strong leader does in that moment that maybe a less experienced person wouldn't do. What is it like? Because it's a company wide event. How do you triage and manage it properly?
There were so many of those. I mean, so in sort of like in engineering kind of terms, we usually call these incidents. And at a company and a product like Render, we have many of those. So really, what happens in something like this is it's never like purely a technical problem. So there's like engineers are going to work on solving the technical aspect of it. So you imagine the site has gone down, which happened many times for us, but there will be so many other non-technical and business angles to be thought of, like things like who's communicating with the users, like what are we communicating, how quickly are we giving updates, does this is this one of those things where we're going to like refund users for downtime. All of these essentially like there's this combination of tech and business. So you need folks, you need key decision makers in the sort of the incident room in these scenarios. One is to be able to sort of like quickly answer these decisions, or get the CEO involved if required, or also to sort of like make sure that all the right people from the engineering side or related are doing the right thing. So there's this angle of sort of coordination that's required, because typically when something first happens you might not actually even know what's going on. So it's like, are the right people in the room, are they focusing on the right problem, is someone thinking of something else? Just there's in sort of like incident management, there's usually a role there. And at an early stage startup, it's often the head of engineering or an eng leader that takes we call it incident commander. And you're often that person basically. And there's also this sense of you're setting the tone for how in those scenarios you can't be the kind of person who's just like running around like everything's on fire or the sky is falling. And you also have to make sure that no one else does that. So because that's not for any good reason, but literally like that is what's going to slow things down. Like recovery is going to slow down if everyone panics. So it's like your job to make sure that basically your job is to make sure that everyone stays calm and like fixes things as quickly as possible. And often as the leader in the room, you're doing like for pretty much every single, so root cause analysis is the term used, like you're the one like writing the RCA or like reviewing the RCA, editing the RCA, talking to your you know uh, most important users. Like you're the one getting on the phone sometimes with them and explaining to them what happened. You're like the face of sort of like the engineering side, and literally you're the one apologizing.
So in the middle of the incident, it's important for the eng leader to keep level-headed and not compound the problem. After the
Yeah.
fact, doing root cause analysis, it's important to
Yeah.
sort of step up as a leader and say, "This is me," because this is your
Yeah.
leader. A leader steps up in front of their team.
Yeah. And really making sure that, I think the biggest part is not so much about the team, it's about making sure that your users are satisfied with that you, because So much like a key thing that I've realized with incidents is not users will forgive, like, even pretty bad incidents as long as the communication, like, they don't feel that you let them down in the communication. The worst example is, if you drop the comms in any way, that's when users get really mad at you. But if you are always communicating and being as transparent as you can with your users through the incident and after, that's the best way to actually like, it's actually like retain their trust. It's when you try to, and that's primarily what the eng leader's job is in a lot of these, is like translating what happened internally to the right level for your users. Like the fastest way to lose trust is to like not share what was happening when it is happening. Like you actually have to share real time, because you can't go dark when the incident's happening. You have to be like, the service is down, we're on it, and this is what's going on, and you have to give like this consistent update. Companies get burned if they miscommunicate more than they do on the
Right.
incident
Miss
severity
or under
perspective.
communicate
Yeah.
more than over. Yeah. Yep. We don't to belabor it more. We lived through this at Okta, of course, and we saw this done very well there. I think the advice applies equally to uptime and SLA as much as to security incidents.
Yeah,
Same principles. Yeah.
totally. Very same. I mean, I think they're like essentially kind of
Yeah.
like paired basically.
Totally. So let's talk a bit about just building high performance engineering teams, right? Building world class engineering teams. Maybe this is a hiring question, maybe this is a coaching question, but what does it mean to have that high of a bar? And how do you do that? How do you build teams and a culture? I guess I should say of high performance, high expectations of each other.
I think it is hiring. I actually think it's actually both the things you mentioned, hiring, coaching, and then also the third kind of thing, which is the the realizing when it's not a fit and moving on quickly. Because like, because the only way it's sort of a little bit like gardening, where you have to be like very consistent in like the planting, weeding, and sort of the planting, fertilizing, and weeding part of it, where you can't like, you actually have to be good at all of them. You have to be good at hiring, because that's just like the absolute minimum to get the right people in the door. Then you have to be good at realizing when it's a coaching situation, and then good at realizing when it's not a coachable situation, and moving quickly between both of those. Because it's a lot like the metaphor I use is, it's sort of a bit like, kind of like you're in a boat together, and if you don't have the right team, that's a problem. But then if someone on the team stops rowing, it actually affects everyone else immediately. Especially, and this is actually far worse at early stage startups and smaller teams than it is at larger companies. Larger companies can sort of absorb someone like, not pulling their weight for a while, but smaller places really can't, because it's just like so much work, there's no room for people to slack off.
Yeah, and then the smaller startups, the one benefit of that scenario is that there's no place to hide, so people know
Yeah.
very quickly,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
got it. And then talk a bit about how engineering as a function kind of partners with the business, right? I mean, engineering exists to ship products that salespeople are committing that they haven't built yet, or that product managers are saying, we got to deliver. How do you kind of make sure as a leader, speaking as an engineering manager, that you're sort of, I guess, balancing making sure your team is doing the things that business needs, but also maybe pushing back if needed on the business when the expectations are getting out of line? How do you balance that?
I think so. My belief here is that it really has to be a very high trust and also very high communication relationship, where both parties should sort of really trust each other. And the only way to kind of trust each other is when sort of engineering and sales, or engineering and product, or like, all the sort of stakeholders really believe that they're on the same team. You cannot take the approach of, oh, I'm going to, as an eng leader, like, so I'll sort of speak for an eng leader, where I think the right approach, and the one that I've personally taken, is it has to be very much like, you can't take the approach of, it's like us versus them. It's like, I'm going to protect my eng team from the sales organization. Like that serves no one, and honestly creates a very adversarial internal dynamic, which is just a recipe for disaster. The right way to do it is, we're on this team, and if there is a problem, if you feel like one of the parties is being unreasonable, like, dig into it and figure out what's going on. versus trying to assume, like really assuming that you're all on the same team and you're all going in the same direction, continuing with the boat
So
analogy.
what you're saying is all those leadership offsites are actually valuable. You can, when
They
you
are
have
actually,
sales and product.
yes, yes, as long as you're done in the right way. Like, don't do like cringe trust falls. But I really believe that, like in like all the roles I've been in, I've always actually just believed in like having this sort of culture, just like talking directly to people,
Yeah,
where you actually just like you meet with your counterpart. Like, so in the if I'm on the internal infra team, I meet with the
yeah,
product teams to see what
yeah.
they need from my team. Similar.
Yeah, and I'll just add maybe a comment. Maybe if you have a reaction or not, it's fine. It's like a champagne problem if you've got this tension, because the worst in a growth stage startup, early stage startup, is there's no push and pull because there's no
Yes.
product market fit. I mean, that's much a worse
Yes.
place to be when there's no pull
Yes.
from the field or from the market.
Yes.
It's because the tension that when it exists, this tension between sales, product, and eng, is because the market is pulling
Yep.
products out of the business, and that's a way better place to be that we've got hair on fire than like, well, nothing's working. What now,
No, I
right? So
agree. I agree. I've always, I've actually said this. I actually said this last night at a dinner where, it's like, you should like any good, well-working startup, you should actually just have like a ridiculous backlog. If you don't have a ridiculous backlog of things you want to get to that you're not getting to, you actually have a different problem.
that's great. That's very good. I love that. All right, so I'm going to ask a question on behalf of the many startups in the world who sell products to engineers and engineering leaders. So, there's a ton of them. We've backed some. We will continue to back them. It's a big market, obviously. But how do you, as an engineering leader, think about that trade-off? I mean, this is the always presumably the trade-off, and of course, the constraints are capital, uh, customer facing features rather than sort of internal product engineering facing tools. How do you think about build versus buy as you get pitched,
Yeah.
technical products for engineers?
Yeah, it really depends. I think that's a pretty broad spectrum. I actually do think the economics of it have changed. And I think this is actually one of the areas in which the economics of sort of like developer tools have changed a little bit. Like, so in the previous era, and it's sort of related to the end of sort of zero interest rates, but it's like so zero interest rates. The end of that caused you know a sort of a reversal in the talent shortage. So now you actually have it's sort of shifted where more companies did layoffs. So there's like actually more talent available than demand. So in a world where there was a talent shortage, it was in everyone's interest to like get the most out of that talent and make them as productive as possible. So that was like a key constraint, and it was also like a hiring thing. You gave your engineers a lot of leeway to buy the best top line tools and all of that. So you did that. So that was like the writing concern. And now it's shifted where you know talent is more plentiful, so it's no longer being done for hiring reasons. But there still is a good reason, which is okay, now you want to do more with your engineering teams with less. So the pitch has shifted to making your existing teams more productive in a way of making them more efficient, instead of like it used. So it's a very subtle shift where it has shifted from being able to hire the best and keep them productive and happy to keeping smaller, more leaner teams and making them be the most productive they can. So in the previous era, it was like I need like I'm going to give engineers budgets so that they like are happy and productive, and the best engineers want everything, and I can't hire enough people, so I'm going to rely on tools. And now it's I want to keep my team small, so I want to rely on tools to not have to hire headcount. So that has shifted a bit. A key nuance, I think, is where previously people were less concerned with margins. I think the build versus buy, I think a big factor now is whether the tool that you're buying for your team affects your margins, which directly affects your bottom line versus not. So that's a key factor that used to not be talked about like 5 years ago. So,
That
you
sounds
know,
right. Yeah, yeah. No, it's shifted. I think you're right. This is the new era post ZIRP. We're a few years into the new world now, but it does feel in our own portfolio we see the same thing. And so the bar has gone up. You've got to really add value. This is true of all software functions, not just the engineering function. But the bar has gone up, and luckily with AI, you are seeing truly magical experiences being done for a function like engineering that actually is well suited to language models, as opposed to maybe some other functions. So it's just like one thing goes down, the other thing starts to take
Yep,
off. It seems, yeah.
exactly.
Awesome. Let's talk about, and then I think we're towards the end of our time, but I really want to dig into career side of things. We've touched on it here and there. I'd love to hear about, how you think about sharing some of the learnings you've had in the career context. We can talk about angel investing as well, and then we'll wrap. So let's see, on the career side of things. I guess maybe we'll start with you first, and then we'll talk about your advice for earlier career engineering talent or anyone. How did you have you and do you, as you think about new opportunities, um, what's your kind of framework? What you kind of shared it maybe with your first move from VMware to Stripe, but what is your um, you know process as you think about when and which opportunities to pursue?
I think I continue to do the thing that sort of keeps options open versus narrowing them. So that's a framework I found continues to be helpful. Though I think it is less helpful, as you continue your career because you have started to specialize. I have sort of specialized over the last decade, and you don't want to continue to stay like too much of a generalist over time. So that sort of shifts between your first decade of your career to subsequent ones. Things I tend to optimize for are which have served me well is like, can I learn, like what is it that I'm going to be learning, and learning in different dimensions. So it's about, am I learning and growing in a at least in a slightly uncomfortable way, actually. Like, it makes me very nervous if I'm on a team and I feel like I'm not learning from everyone around me, including people that report to me. That is a real bar. Like, I want to be on a team where I am learning from other people and not just be like the know-it-all in the room. And I don't think I've ever been the know-it-all in the room. That's really important to me. And then there's this angle of really just the people. After having worked for a long time, I've just seen, in spite of being such a big industry, Silicon Valley is like a surprisingly small world. You continue to work with the same kind of people. So what I try to optimize for is, if I'm joining this place, will I be happy, and like will I continue to take these, like, connections. Like, if it a test is, if everything, zeroes out, like, imagine the equity zeroes out, if it's a startup or even if it's a large company these days, will I still have learned, and will I still have, like, made like, formed these lasting connections with people that will, like, I'll be glad I made, like, will I meet people that I'm glad to have learned from or like met otherwise. that
Right.
that's sort of like the test.
That's great. That's really good. I love that. Both of those are make a lot of sense. Nothing to add there. Let's flip it to the advice as a hiring manager. Right, you see a lot of candidates. The bar is high. We've talked about that. What are you looking for in candidates? What makes someone stand out? Either if they're direct to you or maybe a skip level below you. But what makes people stand out in engineering in these kind of roles?
I think in the really basic, very tactical aspect of it, people that really care about what they're doing and, like, have like a good rationale behind it. So, like, something that makes people stand out is, and you'd be surprised, but this is a really low bar. Like, they actually want to join the company. They've done the research. They care about this particular product versus all of the other places, versus just like blindly joining a call. So, and it's completely okay that, you're one of 10, 20 other places they're interviewing at. But people that have, like, done their research and show up prepared and have ideas and opinions to contribute versus are passive. And, like, there it's the interview is both ways. I'm completely expecting myself to be interviewed, but people that kind of bring that, curiosity and learning mindset is really huge versus someone that's kind of going through the motions. It's like, and I get it that it's hard. I really feel for particularly early career folks in this environment, like, it must be a grind to just like interview a ton. But I think you do have to still be selective and put, like, put thought into the process, and being thoughtful and deliberate is what I look for. And then obviously it's like, can you do the job and all of that? But being thoughtful and deliberate is really like a big part of doing well in an interview.
Got it. So it sounds like candidates can stand out by actually being invested in this role, which,
Yes.
if they're interviewing for many, is hard for them to say, well, this is just another interview. But if they come prepared,
Yeah.
that's your leg up on other candidates who just think of it as
It's
just
very
another
much
interview.
like you're building a relationship, so you kind of have to start with that. Like the interview process in many ways is it is the potential beginning of a relationship. So you kind of have to like start with that mindset, which is like,
Yep.
how can I work with this person at this company and vice
Yep.
versa.
Yep. And then maybe very briefly, you touched on it earlier, but very briefly, you mentioned when things, the team makes a mistake or it's just not a mutual fit, and you said you've got to make those changes quickly. How do you assess, or you have your team who is managers assess? Look, we think this may be
It
too
tends to
far
be
along.
very situational,
Okay.
honestly. You do have to approach it with sort of open-minded inquiry always. Like, you do have in all of this, you can be thoughtful and approach it with like what's actually going on here and based on your findings, like you can quote someone or there's something else going on and you fix it versus not. But I think it's just like, again, if you just approach it with like this is we're just being like very honest and transparent,
Mm-hmm.
I think that actually benefits everyone.
Yeah.
I think what people get caught up in too much is like the emotional side, but then what
Sure.
that almost like becomes like a crippling aspect. This is sort of like the radical candor approach. Like
Yeah.
if you can be like, if you care deeply and are extremely like candid with the person, like that's
Mm-hmm.
actually the best
Way better.
way to approach it versus the ruinous empathy column where you kind of let people flounder.
That's really good. Yeah, and we believe in this analogy. I think it's attributed to Reed Hastings at Netflix, right? Which is, this is a professional sports team, right?
Yep.
This is, we're
Yep.
here to win, and if it's not going
Yep.
to work, either me or you, we have to make a change. This isn't a family per se.
And in many ways it's also like it benefits no one to be in the wrong role,
Yeah.
like including the person in that role.
Totally agreed. Let's end on a lighter note. Um, like I said at the top, we met through First Round Capital's angel investing program, Angel Track. I've made a lot of great relationships through them, so shout out to First Round. How and why did you get intrigued by the idea? Now that you're pretty far along in your career, to write checks, was it, what was the impetus for getting involved in this kind of thing?
Yeah. It was actually like driven by me joining Render, which is a very early stage startup.
Okay.
So that's when I kind of, started getting more fascinated by like, this is how Render works internally. And like, I know the nuts and bolts. And so I wanted to actually like see what other startups were doing.
Okay.
And it really came from this sort of curiosity and wanting to learn. So I kind of approached angel investing as I want to learn about how other businesses work. And my
Mm-hmm.
sort of internal pitch to my partner was I'm going to think of this, my angel sort of allocation, as my personal MBA.
Mm-hmm.
And
That's good.
it's
Very
it's
good.
it's about learning, and it's not about, I mean,
Returns.
obviously I do hope to make returns,
Yeah.
but the primary function is at least for the first, the first fund is learning.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And it's my
Yeah.
own money, so
Has
it's
has it
okay
has
to
it
have that.
uh, has it worked out that way? Have you learned a bunch
It's
about
too
businesses?
early. It's too early to say in like the financial angle, but yes, I've learned so much. There's actually a funny parallel that I draw between angel investing and hiring. I actually think that so many of my hiring tactics, or like hiring things I've learned about hiring well, actually translate well to angel investing. It's a very similar sort of art and science, basically.
Got it. Got it. Okay, awesome, Uma. I'll let you go. This has been super fun. I'm going to leave you with the mic open ended. Is there anything you want to share? Anything that sort of always kept you up at night, no matter kind of how many times you've been through it? Or does life just get better and easier? Is that,
Yeah.
I'm interested in
No,
your thoughts on
I
that, or
think
anything
you'll
else.
appreciate this one since you were at Okta. I think security incidents never get better. Security and infrastructure incidents never get better,
Yeah.
um, no
Right.
matter how senior you are. I think
They
you just
probably
get
get
more help.
better how you manage them, but just
Yes.
they're never easier, I
Yeah.
suppose.
I honestly think that as you get more senior, they actually get worse
Why?
because you go from being a participant to being the person who's making the calls.
Yeah, yeah. Well, you're taking bullets and you're communicating, and I can totally get that. Well, Well, other than that, I'm sure things have gotten better and easier for
Yes.
you over time. Thank
Yes,
you
for
for the
sure.
time, Uma. Look, I'm really glad to have spent this time with you. I'm glad to have gotten to know you. We want to put you in front of all our companies so that they can learn from your wisdom. And I appreciate you doing this. And let's be in touch and find more ways to collaborate over time.
Yes, very excited.
Thanks
Thanks for
so much.
having me.
Talk soon.